The Beatles were humiliated at their first concert until their last song left everyone stunned. Manchester, England, February 1961. The Cavern Club's smaller, grimier cousin, the cellar door, sat beneath a butcher shop on a forgotten street corner. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, stale beer, and broken dreams. This was where bands came to die, where the music scene's rejects played their final notes before returning to factory jobs and ordinary lives. 4 young men from Liverpool stood outside in the freezing rain. John Lennon, 20 years old, leather jacket soaked through, stared at the peeling paint on the club's door. Paul McCartney, 18, clutched his Hofner bass like a lifeline. George Harrison, 17, the baby of the group, tried to hide his shaking hands. Pete Best, their drummer, looked the most confident, but even he felt the weight of what this night meant. They called themselves the Beatles, a name John had dreamed up, playing on Buddy Holly's crickets. Beatles. It was clever. It was different. But clever names didn't matter if you couldn't play. And tonight, they had to prove they could play. This wasn't their first gig. They'd played Hamburg. They'd played the Cavern. They'd played church halls and youth clubs. But this was different. This was Manchester. This was a crowd that didn't know them, didn't love them, didn't care if they lived or died. "We're going to show them," John said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of defiance mixed with desperation. "We're going to blow their bloody minds." Paul nodded, but his eyes betrayed his fear. George said nothing, just tuned his guitar for the 100th time. Pete adjusted his drum kit, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. They had been promised a proper audience, a real crowd. What they got was 40 people, most of them drunk, all of them hostile. The opening band had been terrible, the skiffle group that couldn't keep time. The crowd was already angry, already disappointed. They wanted their money back. They wanted blood. The Beatles were the sacrifice. "Next up," the club owner announced with all the enthusiasm of a man introducing a funeral. "From Liverpool, the Beatles." The response was immediate. Laughter. Not the good kind, the cruel kind. The kind that cuts through leather jackets and teenage bravado and exposes the frightened boys beneath. "The Beatles?" someone shouted. "What kind of stupid name is that?" "Probably play like insects, too," another voice called out. John felt his jaw tighten. This was it. This was their moment, and it was already going wrong. They took the stage, a wooden platform barely elevated from the floor, sticky with spilled drinks and cigarette ash. The lights were harsh, unforgiving, showing every bead of nervous sweat, every trembling hand. Paul plugged in his bass. The amplifier crackled, then died. The crowd laughed harder. George's guitar strap broke as he lifted it. More laughter. Pete's kick drum pedal stuck. The laughter was becoming jeers now. "Get off the stage, you Liverpool wankers. Go back to the docks. You're embarrassing yourselves." John stood at the microphone, his hands gripping his guitar so hard his knuckles were white. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They were good. They knew they were good. They had something special, but none of that mattered if they couldn't even get through a song. "We're the Beatles," John said into the microphone, his voice cracking slightly, "and we're going to play some rock and roll for you." "Play something good then," a voice shouted. "If you can." The stage was set, not for triumph, but for humiliation. 4 boys from Liverpool, standing in a Manchester basement, facing a crowd that wanted them to fail. The dream of being something more, of escaping the ordinary, of making music that mattered. It was all about to crumble, unless they could find something inside themselves. Something raw, something real, something that could turn mockery into magic. The night was young, and it was about to get much, much worse. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John Lennon had always been different. Not in the way that made you popular, in the way that made you dangerous. He was the boy who questioned everything, who challenged teachers, who refused to accept the ordinary life that Liverpool offered its working-class sons. Music was his weapon, his escape, his only chance at something more. Paul McCartney was the charmer, the one with the face that made girls scream and mothers smile. But beneath the charm was a desperate need to prove himself. His mother had died when he was 14. Cancer. Sudden. Brutal. Music became his way of keeping her alive. Every note he played was a conversation with a ghost. George Harrison was the quiet one, the youngest, the one who had to fight twice as hard for half the respect. He'd met Paul on the bus to school, bonded over guitars and Chuck Berry. He played with a precision that belied his age, but precision didn't matter if no one was listening. Pete Best was the outsider, the handsome one, the one the girls screamed for. But he wasn't really part of the brotherhood. Not yet. Maybe never. He kept the beat. He showed up. But something was missing. Something the others felt but couldn't name. Together, they were the Beatles. 4 boys who believed they could be something more than Liverpool offered. More than factory work. More than the docks. More than the gray, rain-soaked streets that seemed designed to crush dreams before they could take flight. They had played Hamburg, the Reeperbahn. 8-hour sets in strip clubs where the audience was more interested in the girls than the music. It had been brutal, exhausting, but it had made them tight, made them good, made them believe. The Cavern Club in Liverpool had embraced them. Those sweaty lunchtime sessions where office workers and shop girls would cram into the underground venue to hear them play. They were local heroes there. But local heroes didn't change the world. They needed more. They needed to break out. They needed nights like this, in Manchester, in front of strangers, proving they could win over any crowd. Except they weren't winning. They were dying. Their first song, a cover of Long Tall Sally, had been a disaster. Paul's bass amp kept cutting out. George's guitar was out of tune. John's voice, usually so confident, sounded strained, desperate. Pete kept time, but the energy was all wrong. The crowd wasn't just unimpressed. They were actively hostile. "This is rubbish. We want our money back. You call this music?" Between songs, John tried to banter with the audience. It was something he was usually good at. The quick wit, the sharp tongue, the ability to win people over with humor. But tonight, every joke fell flat. Every attempt at connection was met with mockery. "You from Liverpool, then?" someone shouted. "That's right," John said, trying to sound confident. "Explains why you're so bloody terrible." The laughter that followed was like a knife. Paul looked at John. George looked at the floor. Pete just kept his eyes on his drums. This was humiliation, pure and simple. They were being torn apart by a crowd that had decided they weren't worth listening to before they'd played a single note. Their second song, "Roll Over Beethoven," went slightly better. At least the equipment worked, but the crowd's hostility hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown. People were talking over them now, turning their backs, heading to the bar. The ultimate insult, indifference mixed with contempt. "One more song," the club owner said, appearing at the side of the stage. "Then you're done. You're clearing the room." John felt something break inside him. This was it. This was how it ended. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. 4 boys from Liverpool, humiliated in a Manchester basement. Their dreams crushed under the weight of a hostile crowd and failing equipment. But then something else stirred. Something darker. Something defiant. If they were going down, they were going down fighting. If this was their last song, it was going to be on their terms. Not a cover, not something safe. Something raw, something real, something that came from the depths of their Liverpool souls. The question was, did they have the courage to play it? The stage lights felt like interrogation lamps, harsh, unforgiving, exposing every flaw, every bead of sweat, every moment of doubt. John Lennon stood at the microphone, his guitar hanging heavy around his neck, and looked out at the crowd. 40 people, maybe less now. Some had already left. Others were actively ignoring them, deep in conversation, treating the Beatles like background noise. Unwanted background noise. One more song, the club owner had said. One more chance to salvage something from this disaster. One more opportunity to prove they weren't just another failed band from Liverpool. Paul stepped closer to John. What do we play? His voice was quiet, defeated. This wasn't the confident Paul who charmed everyone. This was a scared 18-year-old who was watching his dreams crumble. George looked up from his guitar. Maybe Twist and Shout? People like that one. They don't like anything we're playing, John said, his voice flat. They've already decided we're rubbish. Pete, from behind his drum kit, said nothing, but his face said everything. This was a disaster. They all knew it. John's mind was racing. They could play it safe, do another cover, get through the song, get off the stage. Go back to Liverpool with their tails between their legs. Tell themselves it was just one bad night, that it didn't mean anything, but it did mean something. It meant everything. Because if they couldn't win over a crowd of 40 people in a basement club in Manchester, how were they ever going to fill stadiums? How were they ever going to be more than just another band that almost made it? I want to play something different, John said suddenly. Paul looked at him, confused. Different how? That song I've been working on, the one I wrote last week. Paul's eyes widened. John, we've barely rehearsed it. We've played it maybe twice, and it's not finished. It's finished enough, John said, his voice gaining strength. And it's ours. Not Chuck Berry's, not Little Richard's, ours. George shook his head. John, they're already hating us. If we play something they don't know, something we barely know, then what? John interrupted, his voice rising. They'll hate us more? They'll throw things? They'll laugh? They're already doing all of that. The truth of his words hung in the air. They had nothing left to lose. They were already at rock bottom. The only question was whether they'd go out playing someone else's music or their own. What's it called? Pete asked. John paused. He hadn't really named it. It was just a song. A raw, angry, desperate song he'd written in his Aunt Mimi's house at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep, when the weight of trying to be something more than ordinary was crushing him. It's called Hello, Little Girl, John said, and it's about wanting something you can't have, about being invisible, about screaming into the void and nobody hearing you. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. That's exactly what they were doing right now. Screaming into a void, being invisible. If we're going to fail, John said, looking at each of them in turn, let's fail playing our own music. Let's fail being the Beatles, not being a bad copy of American rock and roll. Paul took a deep breath, then nodded. All right, let's do it. George adjusted his guitar. If we're going down, might as well go down swinging. Pete counted them in with his sticks. Click, 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 click. And then they began to play. The song started quietly, too quietly for a rock and roll club. John's voice, instead of trying to sound like Little Richard or Elvis, sounded like John. Raw, vulnerable, real. Hello, little girl. Hello, little girl. The crowd, which had been talking over them, didn't immediately notice the change. But slowly, gradually, something shifted. Maybe it was the vulnerability in John's voice. Maybe it was the way Paul's bass line, simple but effective, created a foundation that was different from anything they'd played before. Maybe it was George's guitar work, less about showing off and more about serving the song. Or maybe it was just that for the first time all night, the Beatles weren't trying to be anyone else. They were just being themselves. When I see you every day, I say, hello, little girl. A few people near the front stopped talking, not because they were impressed, but because they were curious. What was this? It wasn't rock and roll. Not really. It was something else, something softer, something more honest. John's eyes were closed now. He wasn't singing to the crowd anymore. He was singing to himself, to every girl who'd ever ignored him, to every dream that seemed impossible, to every moment of doubt and fear and desperate hope. The song built slowly. Paul and George found their groove, their parts intertwining in a way that felt natural, organic. Pete's drumming, usually just keeping time, began to add texture, dynamics. And then came the bridge, the moment where John's voice cracked slightly, where the vulnerability became almost painful to listen to. I'll send you flowers. I'll send you flowers. It wasn't perfect. John's voice wavered. George hit a wrong note. Paul's bass was slightly out of tune. But none of that mattered, because for the first time all night, the Beatles weren't performing. They were confessing. They were bleeding on stage. They were showing the crowd exactly who they were. Four scared, desperate, talented boys from Liverpool who wanted something more than the world seemed willing to give them. The room had gone quiet. Not the hostile quiet of before. A different quiet. An attentive quiet. People were listening. Really listening. The secret, it seemed, wasn't in playing what the crowd wanted. It was in playing what was real. What was true. What came from the depths of their souls. And the Beatles, in their moment of greatest humiliation, had finally found their voice. The song continued, and something impossible was happening. The hostile crowd, the same people who had been jeering, laughing, demanding their money back, were now silent. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of people who had stumbled onto something unexpected. Something real. John opened his eyes, surprised to find people actually looking at him, not with mockery, not with contempt, with curiosity, with something that might even be respect. Hello, little girl. Hello, little girl. When I see you every day, I say, hello, little girl. Paul felt it too. The shift in energy, the way his bass line, which had felt clumsy and wrong all night, suddenly felt right, like it belonged, like it mattered. He glanced at George, who was playing with his eyes closed, lost in the music, his fingers finding notes that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than practice or technique. Even Pete, usually the most detached member of the group, felt the change. His drumming became more confident, more assertive. Not louder, but more present, more intentional. The song wasn't perfect, far from it. John's voice cracked on the high notes. George's guitar was still slightly out of tune. Paul's bass amp was still cutting out intermittently. But none of that mattered anymore, because what they were playing wasn't about technical perfection. It was about truth. In the back of the room, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell had stopped mid-conversation with her friends. She'd come to the cellar door expecting a typical Friday night. Bad bands, cheap beer, maybe a dance or two. Instead, she was witnessing something she couldn't quite name. These four boys from Liverpool, who had been so terrible just minutes ago, were now playing something that made her chest ache. "Who are they?" she whispered to her friend. "The Beatles," her friend said, reading from the handwritten poster by the door. "Never heard of them." "Neither have I," Sarah said, "but I think we will." Near the front, a man named Robert Chen, a music journalist for a small Manchester paper, had been about to leave. He'd seen enough. Another terrible band, another waste of an evening. But something about this final song made him pause, made him pull out his notebook, made him start writing. "Four boys from Liverpool," he scribbled, "playing a song that sounds like heartbreak and hope mixed together. Not rock and roll, not quite pop. Something new, something that might matter." The bridge came again, and this time John's voice didn't crack. It soared, not with power, but with emotion. With every ounce of frustration and fear and desperate ambition that had been building inside him for years. "I'll send you flowers. I'll send you flowers and hope that you'll be my girl." The vulnerability in those words, the simple, almost childlike hope, hit the room like a wave, because everyone in that basement club knew what it felt like to want something they couldn't have, to send flowers that would never be received, to hope for something that seemed impossible. Paul added a harmony on the final chorus, his voice blending with John's in a way that was rough but beautiful. George's guitar solo, just 8 bars, was simple but perfect. Pete's drums built to a crescendo that felt earned, not forced. And then, as the song reached its final verse, something extraordinary happened. A few people in the crowd began to sway. Not dancing, just moving, feeling the music, letting it in. John saw it, felt it, and for the first time all night, he smiled. Not the cocky, defensive smile he'd been wearing earlier, a real smile. A smile that said, "We did it. We actually did it." The final chord rang out. John's guitar, Paul's bass, George's lead, Pete's crash cymbal, all of it coming together in one imperfect, beautiful moment. And then, silence. Not the hostile silence of before. Not the indifferent silence of people who weren't listening. The silence of people who had just experienced something unexpected, something that had moved them in ways they didn't quite understand. John stood at the microphone, breathing hard, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. Would they laugh? Would they jeer? Would they throw things? One person started clapping, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding. Not politely, not out of obligation, but genuinely, enthusiastically. The same people who had been demanding their money back 10 minutes ago were now on their feet, cheering for 4 boys from Liverpool, who had just played a song no one had ever heard before. "More!" someone shouted. "Play another one!" "That was brilliant!" another voice called out. John looked at Paul. Paul looked at George. George looked at Pete. They were all thinking the same thing. What just happened? The club owner, who had been ready to throw them off the stage, was now standing at the side, his mouth hanging open. He'd been running this club for 5 years. He'd seen hundreds of bands, most of them terrible, a few of them decent. But he'd never seen a crowd turn around like this. Never seen a band go from being booed to being cheered in the span of a single song. "One more," the crowd was chanting now. "One more! One more!" John leaned into the microphone, his voice still shaking slightly. That was one of our own songs. We've got a few more if you want to hear them." The response was immediate and overwhelming. "Yes, play them. We want to hear more." And so they did. They played 3 more songs, all originals, all rough, all imperfect, but all real, all honest, all undeniably, unmistakably the Beatles. By the time they finished their impromptu extended set, the crowd wasn't just applauding. They were demanding to know when the Beatles would be back, where they could hear more of their music, whether they had any records out. The secret, revealed in that Manchester basement on a cold February night in 1961, was that greatness doesn't come from perfection. It comes from authenticity, from vulnerability, from the courage to stop trying to be what you think people want and start being who you actually are. The Beatles had walked into the cellar door as 4 humiliated boys. They walked out as something else. Not stars, not yet. But something more important. They walked out knowing they had something real, something worth fighting for, something that could turn mockery into magic. The Beatles stood backstage, a generous term for the damp, cramped storage room behind the cellar door stage, in a state of shock. Their hands were still shaking, their hearts still pounding, the sound of the crowd's applause still ringing in their ears like a beautiful, impossible dream. "Did that just happen?" Paul asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Did they actually like us?" George was sitting on an overturned beer crate, his guitar across his lap, staring at nothing. "They hated us. 10 minutes ago, they absolutely hated us. And then we played something real," John finished. He was leaning against the wall, his leather jacket still soaked with sweat, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. "We stopped trying to be Chuck Berry or Little Richard. We were us." Pete was the most visibly shaken. He'd been with the band for less than a year, and he'd never experienced anything like this. "I thought we were done," he said. "I thought this was it. The end. Back to Liverpool with our tails between our legs." "We were done," John said, taking a drag from his cigarette. "Until we weren't." There was a knock on the door. The club owner, a heavy-set man named Frank Morrison, who had been ready to throw them out 15 minutes ago, stuck his head in. His entire demeanor had changed. Where before he'd been hostile and dismissive, now he was almost deferential. "Boys," he said, I've never seen anything like that. The crowd is asking when you can come back. I'd like to book you for a residency every Friday night for the next month. Double what I was paying you tonight." The Beatles exchanged glances. They'd been paid £5 for tonight's gig. Split 4 ways, that was barely enough for train fare back to Liverpool. Double that was, well, it was still not much, but it was something. More importantly, it was validation. It was proof that what had just happened wasn't a fluke. "We'll think about it," John said, trying to sound casual, trying to hide the fact that his heart was racing, that every fiber of his being wanted to scream yes. After Frank left, Paul turned to John. "Think about it? John, this is exactly what we need. A regular gig, a chance to play our own material, a chance to—" "I know," John interrupted, "but we can't seem too eager. We have to make them want us, not the other way around." It was a lesson John had learned the hard way. Desperation was unattractive. Confidence, even false confidence, was magnetic. Outside the storage room, Sarah Mitchell was waiting, the young woman who had stopped mid-conversation during their final song. She approached them nervously as they emerged. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but determined. "I just wanted to say, that last song, the one you wrote, it was beautiful. It made me feel something I haven't felt in a long time." John, usually so quick with a sarcastic remark, found himself speechless. "Thank you," he managed. That means a lot." "What was it called again?" Sarah asked. "Hello, Little Girl," Paul answered. "John wrote it." "Will you record it?" Sarah asked. "I'd love to hear it again." "We don't have a record deal," George said. The words sounding like an admission of failure, even though they'd just experienced their greatest triumph. "You will," Sarah said with absolute certainty. "After tonight, you will." As they packed up their equipment, the same equipment that had failed them so spectacularly earlier, Robert Chen, the music journalist, approached. He was in his early 30s, with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too many bands come and go. "I write for the Manchester Evening News," he said, showing them his press credentials. "I'd like to do a piece on you, on what happened here tonight." "What did happen here tonight?" Paul asked, genuinely curious. Robert thought for a moment. "You stopped performing and started confessing. You stopped trying to be what you thought we wanted and started being what you actually are. That's rare. That's special. That's what people will remember." He pulled out his notebook. "Tell me about that song, Hello, Little Girl. Where did it come from?" John hesitated. He'd never talked about his songwriting process before. It felt too personal, too vulnerable. But after what had just happened on stage, vulnerability didn't seem like such a bad thing anymore. "I wrote it about feeling invisible," John said. "About wanting something you can't have. about being ignored by the world and not knowing if you'll ever be seen. And tonight, Robert said, writing quickly, you were seen. Tonight, John agreed, we were seen. The article Robert Chen wrote appeared in the Manchester Evening News 3 days later. It was small, just a few paragraphs buried in the entertainment section. But it was the first time the Beatles had ever been written about in a newspaper outside of Liverpool. The first time someone had called them a band to watch. The first time their original music had been praised in print. John kept that article for the rest of his life. It was found in his belongings at the Dakota after his death, yellowed and fragile, but carefully preserved. A reminder of the night when everything changed, when humiliation transformed into triumph, when 4 boys from Liverpool discovered that their greatest strength wasn't in imitating their heroes, but in being themselves. The residency at the cellar door became legendary in Beatles lore. Every Friday night for the next month, they played to increasingly larger crowds. Word spread. People came from Liverpool, from London, from all over that wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. That turned a disaster into a triumph through sheer authenticity. But more importantly, that night in February 1961 taught the Beatles a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their careers. The music that matters most isn't the music that's perfect. It's the music that's real. The music that comes from the depths of your soul. The music that's brave enough to show your scars, your fears, your desperate hopes. The Beatles had walked into the cellar door as imitators. They walked out as innovators. And the world, though it didn't know it yet, would never be the same. The weeks following that February night at the cellar door changed everything. Not overnight, not with a sudden explosion of fame, but slowly, steadily, like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread wider and wider. The Friday night residency became the hottest ticket in Manchester. The cellar door, which had been struggling to fill 40 seats, was now turning away hundreds. Frank Morrison, the club owner, had to hire additional security, had to implement a reservation system, had to deal with the unprecedented problem of success. But more importantly, something had shifted within the Beatles themselves. They had discovered their voice, their identity. They were no longer just another band trying to sound like American rock and roll. They were the Beatles. And that meant something. John wrote prolifically during this period. Songs poured out of him like water from a broken dam. Please Please Me, Ask Me Why, Love Me Do. Each one raw, honest, vulnerable in ways that rock and roll songs weren't supposed to be. Each one unmistakably Beatles. Paul, inspired by John's productivity, began contributing his own compositions. I Saw Her Standing There, P.S. I Love You. His songs were more melodic, more optimistic than John's, but equally authentic. Together, they were creating something new, something that would later be called the Lennon-McCartney sound. George, the youngest, was finding his own voice too. His guitar work became more distinctive, less about copying Chuck Berry and more about serving the song, creating textures and atmospheres that complemented John and Paul's vocals. Even Pete, the outsider, felt more integrated. Though the others didn't know it yet, his days with the band were numbered. But for now, in this moment of transformation, he was part of something special. The story of their humiliation and subsequent triumph spread through the music industry grapevine. Brian Epstein, a Liverpool record store owner who had been hearing whispers about this band, decided to see them for himself. He attended their Cavern Club show in November 1961, 9 months after the cellar door incident. What he saw was a band transformed, confident, original, magnetic. The humiliation they'd experienced in Manchester had burned away their insecurity, leaving behind something pure and powerful. I want to manage you, Brian told them after the show. I think you could be bigger than Elvis. The Beatles, remembering the jeers and laughter of that February night, found the statement almost laughable. Bigger than Elvis? They'd been happy just to get through a single song without being booed off stage. But Brian saw something they didn't yet see in themselves. He saw the potential that had been unlocked that night at the cellar door. The willingness to be vulnerable, to be real, to play their own music their own way, regardless of what anyone else thought. Sarah Mitchell, the young woman who had approached them after their final song, became one of their most devoted fans. She brought friends to every show, spread the word through her social circles. Years later, she would tell interviewers that she'd witnessed the moment the Beatles were born. Not when they formed, she'd say, but when they became themselves. Robert Chen's article, though small, caught the attention of other music journalists. Soon, the Beatles were being written about in Melody Maker, New Musical Express, and other influential music publications. Not as the next big thing, not yet, but as a band worth watching, a band doing something different. The lesson they'd learned that humiliating night in Manchester, that authenticity trumps perfection, that vulnerability is strength, that being yourself is more powerful than being what you think others want, became the foundation of everything they would achieve. When they finally signed with EMI and recorded their first single, Love Me Do, in September 1962, they insisted on recording their own material. Not covers, not songs written by professional songwriters, their own songs. George Martin, their producer, was skeptical. Bands didn't write their own material. That wasn't how it worked. But the Beatles were different. They had learned, in the crucible of humiliation, that their strength lay not in following the rules, but in breaking them, in being authentically, unapologetically themselves. Love Me Do reached number 17 on the UK charts, modest by later standards, but revolutionary for a band playing original material. It proved that audiences were hungry for something real, something honest, something that spoke to their own experiences and emotions. The Beatles' second single, Please Please Me, reached number 1. Their third, From Me to You, stayed at number 1 for 7 weeks. By the end of 1963, Beatlemania had begun. The four boys from Liverpool, who had been humiliated in a Manchester basement, were now the biggest band in England. But they never forgot that night at the cellar door, never forgot the feeling of standing on stage, facing a hostile crowd, with nothing left to lose. Never forgot the moment they decided to stop trying to be what others wanted and start being themselves. In interviews years later, John would often reference that night. "We died on stage," he'd say, "and then we were reborn. We learned that the only way to truly connect with people is to show them who you really are, scars and all." Paul would add, "That was the night we became the Beatles. Not the night we formed, not the night we played Hamburg. The night we stopped imitating and started creating." The ripple effect of that one night, that one decision to play their own music, their own way, in their moment of greatest humiliation, would eventually touch billions of people around the world, would inspire countless musicians to write their own songs, to be vulnerable, to be real. The Beatles had learned a secret that night, a secret that would define their career and change music forever. The greatest performances don't come from trying to be perfect. They come from having the courage to be imperfect, to be human, to be real. Decades later, long after the Beatles had broken up, long after they'd conquered the world and then retreated from it, the story of that February night in Manchester remained. Not in history books, not in official biographies, but in the whispered legends of musicians who understood what it meant to face humiliation and transform it into triumph. The cellar door closed in 1967, a victim of changing tastes and rising rents. But before it did, Frank Morrison installed a small plaque on the wall where the Beatles had played that night. It read, "Here, four boys from Liverpool learned to be themselves. February 1961. Sarah Mitchell, the young woman who had been moved by Hello Little Girl, went on to become a music. She would tell her students about that night, about witnessing the moment when humiliation transformed into magic. The greatest artists, she'd say, aren't the ones who never fail. They're the ones who fail spectacularly and then have the courage to try again. Differently. Authentically. Robert Chen's article, that small piece buried in the Manchester Evening News, was eventually discovered by Beatles historians. It became one of the most sought-after pieces of Beatles memorabilia, not because it predicted their success, but because it captured the moment of their transformation, the moment they stopped being imitators and became innovators. John Lennon, in one of his final interviews before his death in 1980, was asked about the moment he knew the Beatles would be successful. His answer surprised the interviewer. "It wasn't when we played Ed Sullivan," John said. "It wasn't when we had our first number one. It was in a shitty little club in Manchester in 1961. We were dying on stage. The crowd hated us. Our equipment was failing. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. And then we made a choice. We decided to stop trying to be what we thought they wanted and just be ourselves. That's when I knew. Not that we'd be successful, but that we'd be real. And real always wins in the end." Paul McCartney, when asked about the same moment years later, added his own perspective. "That night taught us that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's strength. When you're willing to show people who you really are, flaws, fears, desperate hopes, that's when you connect. That's when magic happens." The lesson of that February night echoed through generations of musicians. When Bruce Springsteen faced his own moment of doubt and humiliation early in his career, he remembered the story of the Beatles at the cellar door. When Nirvana's Kurt Cobain struggled with the pressure to conform to commercial expectations, he drew inspiration from the Beatles' decision to play their own music their own way. The story became a parable, a reminder that greatness doesn't come from perfection. It comes from authenticity, from the courage to be vulnerable, from the willingness to fail spectacularly, and then transform that failure into something beautiful. The cellar door may be gone. The crowd that witnessed that transformation may have scattered to the winds, but the echo of that moment remains in every musician who chooses authenticity over perfection, in every artist who dares to be vulnerable, in every person who faces humiliation and chooses to respond not with bitterness, but with courage. 4 boys from Liverpool walked into a Manchester basement in February 1961. They were humiliated, mocked, told they were worthless. Their equipment failed, their confidence shattered. Their dreams seemed to crumble before their eyes. But in their darkest moment, they made a choice. They decided to play one final song, not a cover, not something safe, but something real, something honest, something that came from the depths of their souls. That choice changed everything, not just for them, but for music, for art, for every person who has ever faced humiliation and wondered if they should give up or keep going. The Beatles proved that night that the greatest performances don't come from trying to be perfect. They come from having the courage to be imperfect, to be human, to be real. They proved that humiliation can be transformed into triumph, that mockery can become magic, that the moments when we feel most vulnerable are often the moments when we're most powerful. They proved that 4 boys from Liverpool, with failing equipment and a hostile crowd, could change the world, not by being what others wanted them to be, but by having the courage to be themselves. The echo of that moment still reverberates in every garage band playing their first gig, in every songwriter wrestling with their demons, in every artist who chooses authenticity over commercial appeal. The Beatles were humiliated at their first concert until their last song left everyone stunned, and in doing so, they taught us all a lesson that transcends music, transcends art, transcends time itself. The greatest triumph is not in never falling. It's in rising after you've fallen, in transforming humiliation into hope, in having the courage to be yourself, even when especially when the world tells you that you're not enough. That's the secret. That's the truth. That's the legacy of four boys from Liverpool who faced their darkest moment and emerged transformed. Not as stars, not yet, but as something more important, as themselves. And that, in the end, is all any of us can hope to be. If this incredible story of transformation, courage, and authenticity moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of being yourself, even in the face of humiliation. Have you ever experienced a moment where failure transformed into triumph? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the moments that changed music history forever.